Hello and welcome to polyplane.com. Today we're going to be talking about sweeps, specifically an operation called sweep 1 or sweep 1 rail. There's a couple bits of anatomy that you need to understand about how a sweep works and then how the pieces play with one another. Here's what happens. You have a rail and you have cross sections, which are these dotted line areas here. And the computer needs to know two things. It needs to know what is it sweeping along, which is the rail, and then what is it sweeping, which are the cross sections. The cool thing about a sweep is by knowing what the rail is, the computer kind of knows in what order the cross sections need to go. So you don't have to worry, like with last week we talked about the loft and how you had to select them in order. With the sweep, you can just select the cross sections as you need to. There's no real order needed to make them work right. Let's take a look at this in action. So I've got my lines here that were pretty close to what I drew in Illustrator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type sweep 1. And it's going to ask me to select a rail, which is this long piece right here. And then I'm going to select my cross-section curves, which is that, these two, and this one, and hit enter. And a prompt will come up, much like the loft, where you get some different options here. Don't really worry about this right now. If you're going to worry about anything, maybe worry about rebuild, because that'll kind of mess with your form a little bit. So if I were to crank this up to like 1,000 and preview it, it'll take a minute here. But I've just made all of the points in the curve to have 1,000 points. So I'm not going to simplify it. I'm just going to keep it as it was, just because the point count is much less, and see how that works. And the other option in here is the align shapes. Much like the loft tool that we discussed last week, I can click on that and I can click on one of these and it'll twist the direction around of the direction of how that curve was generated. But this looks pretty good to me, so I'll hit enter, click OK, and then I'm going to do a shaded preview of this just to see how that form looks. And actually, I'm going to do a render preview of that so you can even see it even further. You know what we'll do? We'll analyze the surface with an environment map. The way I did that was I went up to analyze surface and then just click on environment map. And it's a handy little tool to let you see how things kind of blend together using a reflection map. And that can be anything. Yeah, that looks pretty smooth. I'll probably close that out and go back to shaded for a second. And you can see how the square end sort of blends in to the initial curves. And if I had just done this sweep with the two end parts here, the curve and the square, and I omitted these two middle ones, well, what would happen is the height of the surface would be affected, because these two curves are much more shallow in their height than the end curves. So that's why it's coming down like this and then it's going back up. The other thing this does is it makes the transition from square to round much more abrupt. That's happening right in here, versus if I were to do it the other way, it would, happen a little bit further back here. Let me show you what that looks like. So I'll delete this and I'll do the sweep again. And I'll select the rail and the 2 points. And now you can see that form is much taller and that transition from square to round is much different. So the more information that you give the computer in the way of cross sections, the more it's going to understand what you're trying to say. A few weeks ago, I had discussed the flow tool, and there's an element of the flow tool that is applicable here, and that is proximity to your rail. I have these cross sections actually touching the rail. You don't have to do that. You can actually have them out here. So if I do sweep 1 and I select my rail and I select my cross section, curves, hit enter, it's still going to refer back to that rail. The benefit of having them directly on the rail is if you need to do things a little more accurately. If you just need to reference a rail, you can do it that way. The other thing is, I'm going to keep that, but I'm going to move the curves even further out. And we're going to do a little experiment here. We're going to put it way out here. And I'm going to do the operation again. Curves. Okay. So as you can see, those are pretty identical. They start to deform the further away they get from the rail. But the point of that is you can use a rail that curves aren't touching. The other part of this is your rail doesn't have to be flat. It can be, you know, multi-planar. So let me bend this rail like that. Maybe I'll rotate this one around, move it down kind of close to it, and then we will sweep one, select the rail, select the curves, and you can see now it bends in that third dimension there. It's just something to keep in mind when you're modeling, that you don't necessarily have to always work on one plane. You can twist stuff around, and Rhino's pretty good, and most other programs are pretty good about figuring out what you mean. So yeah, that's the sweep 1. Next week we're going to actually be talking about sweep 2, which, as you may have guessed, involves a secondary rail. Stay tuned for that. All right, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.